Welcome back to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show. If you have a question or a comment about this show or any other shows that we've done, send it to comment at am950radio.com. So I want to start out today's show just by once again thanking Senator Lindsey Port for the interview that she did on last week's show. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, I recommend that you do. A good part of that interview, I had her for the whole show, was talking about like some of the reasons why she got into politics and why she thinks people talking to legislatures actually does mean a big deal to them. And and then we spent a little time on the so-called SAVE Act, where the House of Representatives passed a law which is basically going to disenfranchise millions of women. So, that's up for a vote in the Senate here at some point. So get a hold of your senators and even send stuff to other senators saying, withhold unanimous consent. First of all, add that in there, and then don't give up on the filibuster. Someone needs to start filibustering that when it comes up on the Senate floor. So check out that episode. And I think I'm going to do a future one with her. She we didn't get to everything we wanted to get to on the housing bill, so we'll probably have her back for something about that too. So, and then one other note. Again, I'm taping Wednesday at 11 in the morning. I was just out in the parking lot waiting to come into the building, and I heard Dick Durbin, the Democratic senator from Illinois, is not going to be running for another Senate seat. So, I was happy to hear that. I think he's one of these guys who's been there too long. Nothing against old people because, Bernie Sanders is still doing the job. But Dick Durbin certainly wasn't, in my view, and I'm glad that he's not running again, so hopefully we get a better, younger Democrat in that seat. So, since last week's show we talked with Lindsey, we didn't do the part of the amendments to the Constitution, so we're going to start out with that this week. So we're on the 17th Amendment as we continue our journey through the Constitution. So this amendment is one where, people today aren't all that familiar with it, I don't think, as much as some of the other ones, because they haven't really experienced it in their elections. So, recall when we went through the original Constitution in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1, that's where it says, every state gets 2 senators, right? But it says in there that those senators are chosen by the state legislatures. They figure out who's going to, be the 2 senators from their states. It wasn't an election by the people themselves. So the 17th Amendment is the one that changed that. So now we, the people, vote for the senators directly too, as well as the House members. Now, it didn't used to be that way. But I'm going to get into some of the reasons why, this came to be and some of the ramifications of it. So, the 17th Amendment is another one of these amendments that was proposed by 2/3 of Congress. So under Article 5 of the Constitution, remember, that's where the amendment provisions are. And one way to propose amendments is 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate vote to propose an amendment. And then it takes 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify it. So that's how this 17th Amendment came to be. So this amendment was proposed in Congress on May 13th, 1912. So that's when it passed the Senate. So it had passed the House earlier, passed the Senate on May 13th, 1912. And then it went to the states. And enough states, in that case it was 36, to reach the 3/4 threshold, passed it on So that was Connecticut, was the 36th state. Ratified it on April 8th, 1913. So that's when it became effective. By the way, Minnesota was one of the first states to ratify this. It was the third state to ratify the 17th Amendment here, and they did it on June 10th, 1912. So yeah, this is the amendment that made a major change to the Constitution. Right, so it's broken down into 3 different sections, but Section 1 is the one that says, okay, now the people are going to vote for their 2 senators from each state. So that's the big change to it. Another one is in Section 2, where it says that when a vacancy occurs, like someone dies in office or somebody quits, while their term is still going on, the state governor can set a time for an election to fill the seat, or if their state law allows it, the governor can appoint somebody to fill the seat until the next election, whenever that's going to be. So that's a little bit different, where then originally in the Constitution it didn't let the governor appoint someone to fill the seat. All it said was, well, the governor can set the new election. And I'm going to get into that here in a little bit, because one of the problems and one of the reasons why we have this amendment now is there were times where there weren't any senators. They were 1 down, or in some cases 2 down in some states, because they couldn't agree. When the elections are going to be, or they couldn't agree on who was running. That kind of stuff. So they amend. In Section 2 here on the 17th Amendment, they changed it to the Constitution to add that little part in there too. So this lets somebody, in the seat rather quickly, so that your state doesn't lose any of its representation or any of its voting rights. So, under the old system, some of the state legislatures couldn't, agree on who to put in there. So this is an attempt to remedy that situation. So, Section 3 of the amendment basically says that this amendment applies to future elections for senators. In other words, the people that are already there based on the old system, they all don't have to, redo their elections. But they do when their time is up under the rotation that we covered before, where a third of the Senate goes every 2 years. So for the future elections, then that's where this particular amendment covers. So if you're in the Senate under the old system, you're okay until your next election. So that's what Section 3 says. So this is one of those, a little bit longer amendments, and I'm not going to go through and go through it word for word, but I gave you the highlights here. So, so now for some of the history about this amendment, because I think knowing the history, is helpful as to why this is in the Constitution. Some people, ask about, well, why was the Constitution amended that way? Why was it done that way? Well, a lot of it has to do with the history at that particular time and what was going on in politics at that particular time. So this is one of those time frames in our history where a proposal for the direct election of senators was done not that long after the Constitution was ratified, actually. So some of the first amendments proposed in Congress were in the 1820s. Now, they didn't get anywhere, but they started popping up in the 1820s. So, that was like 30 years since, once the Constitution was ratified or thereabouts, when you started seeing some proposals to do this. So you got to remember, back at that point, back in the 1820s, the early part of the 1820s, the only people who could vote back then were white males who owned property. Now, states had their laws about that, but for the most part, those were the main people who were able to vote at that point. Women weren't, slaves weren't, Native was the white males who owned property. Now, that has since changed, of course, but you got to remember the time frame back then. So there were calls to expand, the number of people who could vote, even back then. And you started seeing that eventually after Andrew Jackson basically got screwed out of it, his first election, where he, that was one of those that went to the House. And John Quincy Adams, ended up making a deal and won in the House. Then you started seeing a bunch of states change their election laws to expand the people who could actually vote. So as time goes on, you got more and more people, voting in elections on certain things, but still not for your senator. So in some states, though, as time again goes on, some states started to change their laws where they were like adding primary requirements, so the parties could have primaries, and then whoever wins those primaries are the ones that the state legislatures had to pick from. So you started seeing some of that stuff. Because remember, back then, right, the people in the state legislatures were basically the elites in the society, the rich guys. And one of the reasons that this amendment ultimately ends up happening is because of all the corruption that goes on. You could literally buy Senate seats, and that's what was going on back then. And the people, in general, were really getting tired of that because it wasn't the majority of the voters deciding, who's the senator. It's the rich elites in the state legislature. So that corruption issue also started gaining traction over time. And by the way, one of the guys who was supporting direct elections was, some guy a lot of us don't like when he was president. That was Andrew Johnson. Was one of these guys who said, yeah, we got to have direct election of senators. Now, there's some reasons perhaps why he felt that way, but still, it's like you don't hear his name pop up very often, but he was one of the guys that was supporting this. But you still didn't get enough support in the Senate, right? Because, this is how they got elected, and they're not going to give that up. You started seeing people in, the House of Representatives you started seeing more people voting to do that. But in the Senate, nope. So then the Gilded Age happened during the 1890s in our country. So this is where the rich people really took over politics and took over society, and it got to the point where the corruption was just not in the Senate, but just politics in general, and it just got bad enough where you started seeing more third parties popping up. And one of those was the Populist Party. And this was part of their platform starting in 1892, was for the direct election of senators by the people. Then you started seeing the press have more and more coverage about the corruption that was going on in the Senate. So this started getting out, to the people more and more and more. They're reading more and more about this stuff going on, which, helped change some of the politicians' minds, particularly in the House, but you started seeing it in the Senate too. Then in 1908, Oregon became the first state to allow direct elections, and then Nebraska did it as well. So you started seeing some of the states changing their laws to basically, as a way to try and get around this state legislature business. And you started seeing the House of Representatives. This came up in the House in 1900, 1904, 1908. Each time it passed in the House, but of course failed in the Senate because the senators didn't want to give up their power. So you could see how this was gaining momentum over time. And then by 1910, 31 state legislatures around the country had passed resolutions calling for direct elections. And plus 10 of the senators that opposed it in the in the 1908 vote when they had it, they lost their election in 1910. So you could see how the people were starting to get, realizing that, well, you're not going to support this. We're not going to vote for you anymore. So 14 new senators were elected who supported the amendment. So this is why by 1912, this is when you got enough support in the Senate. You had that turnover. But by 1912, 27 states had called for the Constitutional Convention to do it, to bypass the Congress. Because that's another way, right? Under Article 5, if you get 2/3 of the state legislatures calling for a convention, that's a way you can propose an amendment. So that momentum was building. And finally, I think the Senate finally saw that, this is going to happen. Because at that point you needed 31 states, so they had 27. So you're getting closer and closer. And by that time, 33 states had the primaries for the candidates that the state legislature could pick. So finally they got enough support in the Senate by 1912. And then it ended up passing. So this issue still comes up today. Some Republicans are saying to repeal it and bring it back to the states. This again shows how much the Republican Party doesn't want the people to vote directly for their representatives. Because if they give it back to the state legislatures, well, then they're going to they're only going to elect Republicans. And Democrats aren't even going to have a shot in many states. So, this is why they want to do it. So this also helps states like Minnesota, where the Democrats have won statewide elections for years. Have to have 2 senators. Right, I think the last time that a Republican won a statewide election in Minnesota was in 2006 when Tim Pawlenty got I think that was his second term. Right, so this is the 17th Amendment. This is the one where the Senate is now directly elected by the people. Ever since 1913. So that's it for the 17th Amendment. Next week, we're going to potentially here at least talk about the 18th Amendment, which, by the way, was prohibition. So when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about some Supreme Court cases. So we'll talk to you on the other side. Welcome back to another segment on Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. Here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. Again, if you have any comments or questions, email it to comment@am950radio.com. All right, so for this second segment, we're going to do a little legal stuff here and some politics mixed in, of course. But we've been following some Supreme Court cases. And so this is another follow-up to that because we've had some movement on some of these cases involving the Venezuelan prisoners that were sent to El Salvador. So that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on here. So there's some updates on the court cases. So the first one was Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He was one of the Venezuelans who was brought down there. The administration agrees that they made a mistake. And yet he's still in the prison there in El Salvador. But the Supreme Court, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, came out with a ruling at that point saying, okay, you got to have due process hearings for future people that you're going to try and deport. So, again, one of my criticisms of that decision was, well, they didn't say anything about the 261 of them that were scooped up, including Garcia, and sent to El Salvador. Now, this is the case where they said, well, the Trump administration has to, quote, facilitate, close quote, their return. So there's been some more on that particular matter as well. So recall that Trump and the Republicans, and by the way, you might be wondering, why are you saying the Republicans? Trump's doing this. Well, it's the Republican Party because they're complicit in this. If they wanted to stop this stuff, they could. The Congress could do something, or they could put pressure on Trump, but they're not. They're going along with this, right? They actually like this, so that's why I'm including Trump and the Republicans when I'm talking about this, right? Because all they did is they picked up these guys on flimsy evidence, if any at all, and sent them off to prison. And our tax dollars are being used to pay for this, by the way. Now, there's different reports on how much. Some reports are out there saying $6 million. But when Senator Chris Van Hollen was there, he talked about, well, we're actually paying $15 million is a number because there's going to be future people going to this prison. And that's part of the deal. So, of course, one of the problems with this whole case is that there's been some investigation into these prisoners. And depending on when you read, between 75% and 90% of these people don't have a current criminal record. They're not charged with any crimes. But yet they're in a maximum security prison in El Salvador. Still, even after the Supreme Court made this ruling, even after Senator Van Hollen was down there, even after some people in the House were just down there. Like, what the hell is going on here, Trump and Republicans? Get these guys out of there. You can bring them to a prison in the United States, and then they can have their hearings. But I don't know. So this is, again, why I say the Republicans are complicit in this. So, part of the claim here that Trump is using is, well, we're at war with Venezuela, these gang members, and this is how he's using the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act to imprison these people. But, we're not at war with Venezuela. We're not at war with anybody. So that was the initial Supreme Court decision. So now they came up with a second one. In the middle of the night early Saturday morning. The Saturday morning just before Easter. So if I'm getting my days right here. So the Supreme Court has come out and made an order, but once again, they did not say anything about these 261 Venezuelans people in the prison in El Salvador. Thanks for nothing, John Roberts, and the Republicans on the Supreme Court. But here's what they did say, at least. I give them at least credit for this much. They came out and said that you can't do any future deportations to El Salvador. Because what was going on is more Venezuelans and some other illegal, undocumented people were being scooped up. And there was a bunch of, a lot of the lawyers that were representing these people were hearing that, okay, they're going to fly more people down to El Salvador, violating the earlier Supreme Court order. So the ACLU, representing a bunch of these people who were next in line, so to speak, got an emergency hearing in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can't do this. Because I think they know in their heart of hearts Trump is trying to screw them over and not follow their court orders. So they kind of, at least at this point, said, well, okay, you can't do any future deportations. They put them all on hold. Now I have a feeling Trump is going to, try and violate that too. But at least they went that far. So saying, okay, no more people are going to El Salvador, period. And that was a 7-2 decision. So, of course, the usual suspects, Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas, didn't like that, so they voted no. And by the way, we also have I just found out about this yesterday, a Colorado judge has now kind of weighed in a little bit on this case too, or on similar cases. One of the issues was, well, how much notice do you have to give the person before they have their due process hearing? The Supreme Court said you had to have this hearing. But they didn't give any, time frame or anything. Well, a judge in Colorado, a federal judge, has now said, okay, you got to give 21 days notice. It has to be in their language, their native language, that this notice, in case they can't read English. And in that notice, it has to say they have a right to a lawyer. The Trump administration argued for 24 hours. Right, and this judge said, no, that's not going to work. So she ruled 21 days. Now I'm sure that's going to get appealed, and this is how the court system works under the Trump administration. They simply won't just follow that. But anyway, that's a lower court judge has just come out with that decision, because again, the Supreme Court hasn't really said provided any details over that. But we at least know that Garcia is still alive. At least he was when Senator Van Hollen was down there. Who knows about now? Let's hope he is. But, Trump and the Republicans aren't doing anything to get him back. They're intentionally not following the Supreme Court order. Simple as that. Now we have a constitutional crisis. We've had some of them before already, but now we got one because they're not following the order. These guys are just sitting in jail down there. For how long, right? It's like there's no hearings. There's nothing scheduled. How long are they going to be sitting down there? At least 4 years, I guess, while Trump is in office, unless he tries to serve longer than that. But are they going to sit down there for 4 years? It's like, got to do something here, people. So Garcia, remember, he's not a Venezuelan. So why he's, in there is like, well, he's a gang member for one of those Venezuelan gangs. Well, let's not forget that Garcia had a court order from 2019 granting him what's called a withholding of removal order. So he was trying to seek asylum. The immigration judge said, no, you're not going to get asylum, but I'm going to give you a withholding of removal order, meaning the government can't kick you out. You can stay here. Well, they violated that court order, didn't they? Garcia, even at that point, was showing up for his, check-ins with immigration officials, but here he is, sitting in a maximum security prison in El Salvador, in a foreign country. Even though the Trump administration and the Republicans admit he's in there in error. They made an error. He's got this order that says you can't deport him. Well, they're not doing anything to make up for that now, are they? All right, so even though the Supreme Court, came out with the second decision, this one where they said, okay, you can't send off anybody else to El Salvador. Well, great, but it doesn't do those current guys any good. So, again, this is, showing the cowardice of John Roberts and the Republicans on the Supreme Court. Because, they have a 6-3 advantage. I've been saying this over and over and over on this show that, Democrats, yeah, they got 3 votes. That's not going to, they're not going to be in the majority hardly at all. Right? They got to get some Republicans over on their side. And, at least they did here as far as the order goes. But Trump is still violating the order. And the court hasn't done anything to, get Garcia back. None of their orders have said, okay, Trump administration, you go get him. You go get those 261. You bring them back here in, a week, let's say. And put them in a jail or prison or wherever in the United States. And then they can, then they have their due process hearing. You don't see any of that in these Supreme Court orders. Why not? Roberts is afraid of confronting Trump. And what happens when you don't confront the bully is going to confront you. And so Trump is going to, I think, violate these orders anyway. Part of the problem here is, of course, the Supreme Court does not have a Supreme Court police. Right, there's no law enforcement to really enforce their orders, and I'll get to that here in a little bit too. But that's a big problem here, and Trump knows this. So he's going to say, he's going to pull basically an Andrew Jackson saying, fine, you've given your order, now make me follow it. Good luck with that. All right? You can just see this coming. So something else that Trump is doing and the Republicans. Again, you got to put Republicans in here because they're supporting all this stuff. The latest thing that they're doing now is stepping up the revocation of visas, particularly foreign student visas. Well, why are they doing that? Well, there is a federal law that says the courts can't review a revocation of a visa, which is typically done by the Secretary of State. So in this case, it's Marco Rubio. There, I got his name right. So Marco Rubio has been going around revoking visas of foreign students and other people, but a lot of foreign students, because the courts can't review it. And there's been Supreme Court decisions saying this because this is based on a federal law. So hopefully at some point when the Democrats take control of this mess, they change that law. But right now, a court can't review it. So, Rubio basically has the power here. Now, what the courts can review is if these students leave, like self-deport, and they apply for another visa and are denied, you can do a court review over the denial of your application for a new visa. But you can't challenge a revocation of it in court. So what Rubio's doing is going around for the last month or so, revoking over 1,300 international student visas. Because, of course, most of them were involved in protests, or they wrote stuff on social media, taking the side of the Palestinians as against Israel. So this has affected 200 colleges around the country as well. So, he's targeting these students, right? So they're scouring social media to, find out who wrote what, or, looking at the student newspaper. So there was one student that, wrote something in the student newspaper, and she got disappeared. So, when your visas are revoked and you don't leave, well, then they're going to scoop you up. Sometimes they don't even have to let you self-deport. They just come and get you and throw you in a facility and disappear you in a detention facility. We don't even know where some of these students are. Some of them are in Louisiana, but, they're not saying where they are. So now Trump and the Republicans are also stopping U.S. citizens at the border and questioning them. They're also putting visitors to our country in facilities while they're checking their papers. So at some point, they are going to put U.S. citizens in jail. Or they're going to put U.S. citizens in jail in a foreign country. Trump was, he had that meeting with the El Salvador president, and he said the administration is, quote, exploring, close quote, a proposal to detain U.S. citizens and sending them off to the prison in El Salvador. He said the homegrowns are next. I mean, even the libertarian group, the Cato Institute, has come out and said that's the real fear now, that he's going to try and evade judicial review of deportations of U.S. citizens by, sending them off to El Salvador. And I suspect he's going to, go around that court order. So this is something to keep an eye on. One other thing to keep an eye on is lower courts now are gearing up contempt hearings on Trump administration officials for not following their orders. So I hope that they do civil contempt, where they can fine people, seize their assets, throw them in jail, until they comply. Because if they do criminal contempt, which is a criminal charge, Trump can pardon them, because that's a civil crime. He can pardon that under the Constitution. So, and I also hope that the judges notify the bar associations of these lawyers who are, just lying in court. So get ready for, the Trump administration ignoring court orders. What's going to happen then? That's going to be the question I think we're going to be asking soon. All right, so when we come back for our third segment, we're going to talk about Tom Emmer. Oh, what fun. All right, welcome back to the third segment of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Again, thanks for listening to the show. If you have any questions or comments, send them to comment@am950radio.com. So, as I mentioned, going to talk about Tom Emmer a little bit here, and the Republicans in general. But why am I talking about Tom Emmer? Well, he was on one of the weekend shows. And also remember that he is the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives. He is the majority whip there. So, he's got some power in the House. He's behind Speaker Mike Johnson. I call him Mikey J. And Steve Scalise, who is second in line. So then Emmer comes. He's number 3 in leadership in the House. So he was on CNN show on Easter Sunday, and he was asked 4 different times, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 different times, if he supports sending United States citizens convicted of violent crimes to El Salvador's prison. So notice that he wasn't even asked just sending U.S. citizens to the prison, but he was asked about sending U.S. citizens convicted of violent crimes to El Salvador's prison. Now, he was asked, is this legal? Because Emmer's a lawyer. So this is a segment with Dana Bash, and, he or she said that, you're a lawyer, and so she asked him, is this legal? So he was asked this 4 different times. He didn't answer it at all. Anytime, of course. Why would you expect anything else from Tom Emmer or any of the Republicans when it comes to this issue? Because they know they're screwed on this issue. They know that the majority of the people don't support what they're doing, but they don't care. The correct answer to the question, of course, is no, it's not legal. U.S. citizens serve jail time in U.S. prisons. It's really that simple. Whether they're violent criminals or not, they serve their jail time in the United States prisons. So here's some of the dodges that he was trying to do here. First, he says, well, we're going after non-citizens, which, of course, was not part of the question. So then he says non-citizens who are the worst of the worst. Again, that wasn't part of the question, the non-citizens, right? Plus the people, it has been shown that these people that are in El Salvador are not the worst of the worst. 75 to 90% again have not been convicted of a crime. Now they may be in a Venezuelan gang. We don't even know because, of course, we don't have any due process hearings to show if they're what Emmer and the Republicans are saying is actually true. Let's Supreme Court. Let's get on with these hearings, okay? But this is the typical talking point that you get about, well, these illegals are, doing all this stuff. They're non-citizens, blah, blah, blah. Well, that wasn't the question. And then he comes up and he says, well, this is Joe Biden's fault because of all the open borders we had during Joe Biden's term. And, of course, that's not true either. And he's still talking about illegal, aliens. That's what he was calling them at one point there. And, of course, this is the other talking point they always bring up. Is like, well, there was illegal immigrants killed United States citizens. Which is, again, a sad thing, as I've said on this show before. It's like, yeah, we that's not a good thing. But what he doesn't tell you is, as, all these studies, things that have looked at these studies, have studied this thing, show that the crime rate for illegal immigrants is less than the crime rate of American citizens. And it's not even that close, Tom. So this is what they like to do. Is like, well, an illegal killed somebody. Well, Tom, why don't you bring up all the American citizens that are being killed by Americans? Why don't you say stuff like this when people are getting gunned down at colleges or gunned down in their elementary schools? You don't hear anything about, Tom Emmer's big beef about that when, these gunmen kill kids. And, of course, they're white people that are doing the killing, white males. But, this is how they dodge the questions. And, unfortunately, the media lets them get away with it. But at least Dana Bash kept asking him, 4 times. And then finally she's like, well, he's not going to answer it. So, that was basically the end of the interview. But they can't bring themselves to condemn U.S. citizens killing U.S. people, right? So in his mind, an illegal killing some American citizen is more important than a U.S. citizen killing a U.S. citizen, apparently. Because they don't talk about the latter. It's only the former. They're both bad, Tom. Right? But when you listen to him and the Republicans talk about this, that's how they dodge the question. At least Chris Van Hollen and at least some of the Democratic House people are down there trying to uphold the Constitution, Tom, which apparently you are not doing. It's not that they're like the lawyers for a bunch of illegal immigrants. No, what they're doing is they're down there trying to enforce the due process clause of the Constitution, which is what the Supreme Court ordered, Tom. But you can't bring yourself to even say that on national TV because, of course, you would get dear leader pissed off at you again. So then he started, another thing that he started talking about was, we're deporting terrorists, rapists, murderers. No, Tom, none of those guys, or at least 75 to 90% of them, don't fit that profile. And I bet most of those guys aren't rapists, murderers, and terrorists. No, you might have a few of them in there, but the vast majority are not, Tom. Most of them haven't even been convicted of speeding, Tom. But yet, there they sit. And you are gleefully cheering, on the sidelines, going on these TV shows, lying about what's going on. What the Democrats want is they want due process as required by the Constitution and the Supreme Court order. Right? How hard is that to understand, Tom? But his four, non-answers is telling. So what this means is he supports it, plain and simple. Yeah, let's send U.S. citizens. I don't care who they are. Well, let's send them to El Salvador prison. That's what he supports. Because, of course, that's what his dear leader wants. Tom, just come out and say it. That's what Trump wants. Why don't you just say it? Now, of course, probably part of the reason that he won't say it is because that might piss off some of his constituents, even the Republicans that vote for him all the time. That might even be a bridge too far for those people. But this just shows you, what a bootlicker he is for Trump. Even though Trump trashed him when Emmer tried to become Speaker of the House, once they dumped Kevin McCarthy, and Trump just, threw him under the bus. And yet here's Emmer again, just, hey, Trump's just the greatest guy ever. I'll do whatever you want me to do, Trump. Just tell me. So, Tom, I got a question for you. When Trump takes a United States citizen from the 6th District where you represent and sends them unlawfully to the prison in El Salvador, what are you going to do, Tom? Are you going to back Trump when he violates the law? Or are you going to back your constituent who was unlawfully, in violation of the Constitution, sent to a prison in El Salvador? Tom? So, Star Tribune. It's been a while since I mentioned your name on my show, but hey, I can't pass up this one either. Why don't you ask him that yourselves? Why don't you do some old-fashioned journalism? But of course, the Minnesota Star Tribune won't do this. Why? Because they're in the bag with the Republican Party. I've talked about this over and over and over on my show, and the double standards that they use, the media uses with the Republican Party. So why would I expect anything else from the Star Tribune? Why would I expect real journalism from them? But here's the thing, and if you want to have an argument going back at the Republicans and what they're trying to do here, all you got to do is say something like this. But if Biden was doing this, so Biden was in charge, right? He was the one doing all this stuff. Would you be supporting him too? Well, of course you wouldn't be. Would Republicans be letting Biden do what Trump is doing right now? Of course not. They would be sticking a microphone in the face of every Democrat, asking if they support this. Fox News would be saying, impeach Biden, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it's when it's your party, when it's your leader, Donald Trump, you say nothing. You do nothing. You ask none of these Republicans if they support this. And when they go out and when they evade answers like Emmer did, you just let them get away with it. Why should I expect anything else from you? All right, this is one reason why the Star Tribune, you're losing all kinds of subscriptions. And by the way, your paper is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I'm noticing that. It's like, wow. But here's your chance to do some real journalism. But I am not expecting it from you. So, why don't you, Star Tribune, go out and, why don't, if you don't want to go talk to Emmer, why don't you talk to Michelle Fischbach? or Finstead, right? Or Pete Stauber. Any of them. I haven't seen anything. No questions from you about this. So, why don't you go ahead and do it? So let me say something about the DFL party now here too, because I hope that the DFL gets a good candidate to go run against Emmer. Now I realize, if you look at the numbers from the past, that this is, Emmer's seat is going to be tough to beat and all this stuff. But, the election is, I don't know, a year and a half away or so. A lot can happen in politics in that period of time. Especially if, the stock market gets worse, we get into a recession by then, Trump's sending citizens to prisons, in various foreign countries. He's not following court orders, all that sort of stuff. Democrats, if you get a good candidate, who knows what can happen. Right, but if you run if you don't run anybody at all, or if you run a candidate who doesn't really, have much experience or isn't really in the fight, then yeah, you're going to lose. But if you get someone, a good candidate out there who's ready to fight, who will go after Emmer and go after the Republicans, take a shot at it. It's a long way away. So one of the things the DFL party can do right now is go and look at that interview with Dana Bash. Take those sound bites of him not answering the questions and avoiding the questions, and do an ad right now and run it over and over and over up in the 6th district and keep running it. And then when Trump violates a court order and Emmer agrees with it, start running those too. And another suggestion that I have is, I've noticed when I'm driving on Highway 94 that there is a Wright County Indivisible sign out on 94 that attacks Emmer. So, put something up there about this. That's something you could do too. So as I've said over and over and over on this show, if you want some control over your life, especially these days, you got to get involved in politics more. So don't wait. Don't expect that, your politicians are going to save us. The only one that's going to save us now are ourselves. All right, so get involved, go to the protests, register people to vote. There's all kinds of things you can do. All right, thanks for listening to the show. Talk to you next week.